Welcome back to another book highlight. We are at chapter 17 in My Rival the King, and this is an interesting chapter because almost for the first time that we can see in David's journey, he is being led by his own fear and his own emotions. This is the chapter where David decides that we can't go back to Israel as a group. Even though Saul repented in front of his men when I spared him again, he can't be trusted. We can't all go back to Israel. We have to lay low somewhere and serve Israel elsewhere until something happens to Saul. Otherwise, Saul will kill me. That's David's thought process, and he decides to go lead his mighty men and their families to Gath, which is the home of Goliath, the giant he had killed. And he decided to offer his services and his soldiers' military services to the king of Philistia, Achish, in pretense. So David was basically deciding to be a double agent. He would make it look like he and his men were serving Achish, but they would actually be killing enemies of Israel and then lying about it to the Philistines. So they could still continue serving Israel, but they would have a city to live in, and Saul would not come after them because they were in Philistine lands. Now, this was David's plan, but the tip-off that I do not believe that it was God's plan for David, and there's a couple reasons for this. The tip-off is, number one, Scripture doesn't say that David asked the Lord before doing this. It was actually a very bold and risky move, and it did get them a city and some temporary protection. But as we'll see in the very near future, it also led their families into very near disaster. And it was the worst that David had ever felt, the worst trouble that he'd ever been in up to that point. So it was not a great plan, all things considered, and it was very risky. David did not inquire of the Lord. But the main tip-off that this was not probably of God is what started it all was David saying, I am going to die by the hand of Saul one of these days. David had no right to say that. Everything, all the words from God, directly from Samuel, from Jonathan, from Abigail, from people around him, every word from God had been, Saul is not going to kill you. You're going to be king. You just don't know how yet, but it's going to happen for you. So for David to make a decision based on something that was the opposite of what God had said was very foolish, even if it was understandable to be discouraged. David made a decision that was based on fleshly discouragement and fleshly understanding of the situation, and he actually sought refuge in the city of the enemies of Israel. And now God was very gracious to David and got him and his families out of there without the damage that their enemies intended. But it was very risky. And, we have to remember that a way that seems right to a man can lead to death, whereas the blessing of the Lord makes many rich and he adds no sorrow to it. That doesn't mean we're not going to go through hard times. But when our plans are predicated on the promises of God, we can be certain that all of our questions can be taken to him and we will receive wisdom and direction at the very least, and protection beyond that. David, later on, we will see, is devastated because of what his decision brings everybody, the trouble that it brings. David's devastated because he knows it was his fault, that he made a decision as a leader and dragged everybody into this place. But even then, there's a lot of people, a lot of scholars that really look down on David for going to the Philistines, and a lot of them believe that that was unforgivable, that he should not have been allowed to be king after doing that. That it was sort of a betrayal of his Israelite conscience. And yet God still rescued him. God still made him king of Israel. And it was because David was still in pursuit of God. He still desired to do the will of God and pursue God's heart no matter what. But that's very telling for us that even the man after God's own heart was tempted to fleshly solutions because of discouragement. So we need to be following the Lord at all times, but especially in those moments when you are so discouraged and you don't feel like the promises are for you and you just can't see through the fog. That is especially the right time to make sure that you stand on what God has said and that you are pursuing his word, because he has promised that he will give us wisdom if we ask. That's all we need to do, is just ask and believe, and step by step we will see his plan unfolding. That's the plan that we want to bring our families and those following us into. We want to be able to say, follow us as we follow Christ. So a lot of these videos have had mostly the same theme, which is when things get crazy, do not let go of God's hand. Trust him in the dark, even when you can't see. Stick with what you know to be true and don't believe the lies, because God will fulfill every promise he has made to you, and Saul, whatever that is, will not overtake you.